Somewhere in a converted movie theater in Manchester in 1967, a disc jockey played a record that nobody in England had ever heard. It had been pressed in America, flopped completely, and ended up in a warehouse bin. But the moment it hit those speakers, hundreds of working-class kids went absolutely wild. That is the story of Northern Soul, not a genre invented in a studio, not manufactured by a label, a movement built entirely on records that America threw away, B-sides, promo copies, deleted singles, demo pressings that never reached a single radio station. Records that failed in Detroit and Memphis found their second lives in Wigan and Manchester. And those records changed British music forever. Today we're counting down 10 of those forgotten R&B B-sides and lost singles that created the entire Northern Soul movement and the wild, unbelievable true stories behind every one of them. Number 10, Brenda Holloway. Every Little Bit Hurts, 1964. There was a brief window in the spring of 1964 when Brenda Holloway was more famous than the Supremes. She was 17 years old, had just released her Motown debut, and the Supremes were still the bottom-billed act on Dick Clark's Caravan of Stars tour. Berry Gordy discovered Holloway at a party where she sang along to a Mary Wells record. He signed her before he'd even properly heard her voice. But the song that made her famous almost didn't happen. Writer Ed Cobb had originally brought the track to Motown with a demo vocal by a session singer named Barbara Wilson. Motown stripped off the old vocal and simply asked Holloway to replace it. She was furious. She'd already cut the song for a smaller label and hated the idea of re-recording it. The producers ran multiple takes before she finally hit the note they wanted. That final take had real tears in it because she was genuinely frustrated. That raw emotion is what you hear on the record. Every Little Bit Hurts peaked at number 13 on the Billboard Hot 100 and number 3 on the R&B chart. But within 2 years, Motown was ignoring her completely, pouring everything into the Supremes, who had exploded past her. Holloway walked away from the music industry at 22. Her recordings found a passionate second life on the British Northern Soul circuit throughout the 70s. In 2005, Alicia Keys covered Every Little Bit Hurts for her MTV Unplugged special, the biggest audience the song had seen in 40 years. The woman who was briefly bigger than the Supremes finally got the recognition she was owed. Number 9, the Tams. Hey Girl, Don't Bother Me, 1964. The Tams were a vocal group from Atlanta, Georgia. 5 men who had been singing together since the 1950s and named themselves after the Tam O'Shanter hats they wore on stage. Really gets around. Hey Girl, Don't Bother Me was released in 1964 on ABC Paramount Records and reached number 41 on the Billboard Hot 100, a modest American hit that quickly faded from memory. Of every boy in town. In Britain, the record didn't chart at all. It barely registered. And then, in 1971, 7 years after the original recording, everything changed. You look so fine. Northern Soul DJs at Manchester's Twisted Wheel and clubs across the north had been playing it underground for years. The demand grew so loud and sustained that promoters lobbied for a re-release. The record was reissued in the United Kingdom in August 1971. It entered the UK singles chart and climbed all the way to number 1. It stayed at the top for 3 weeks. It appeared on Top of the Pops 8 times in a single summer, 7 years after it was recorded. The Tams were flown to England. They performed on national television to audiences who had been dancing to their song for years in underground clubs. Audiences who knew the record far more deeply than any mainstream pop fan ever could. Music historians cite this moment as one of the first clear proofs that Northern Soul was not simply a subculture. A 1964 U.S. R&B record reaching UK number 1 in 1971, driven entirely by grassroots underground demand, proved that thousands of working-class British kids had better musical taste than the entire mainstream record industry. And they had proved it without anybody's help. Listen, 90% of you watching these videos right now ain't subscribed yet. If these stories are blowing your mind, imagine what you're missing. Hit subscribe, turn on that bell, and join the R&B fans who never miss a Groove Lens upload. Number 8, Edwin Starr, Stop Her On Sight, SOS, 1966. Edwin Starr is best remembered for War, the ferocious anti-Vietnam anthem that hit number 1 in 1970 and became one of the most covered protest songs in history. But years before War, when Starr was still a young singer on the Tiny Rick Tick label in Detroit, he recorded a song that became one of the defining anthems of the entire Northern Soul movement. Stop Her On Sight, recorded in 1966, was an up-tempo soul eruption. Everything the scene demanded: a driving beat above 100 beats per minute, a brass section that hit like a fist, a lead vocal so urgent it sounded like a man genuinely sprinting down a street. It reached number 9 on the American R&B chart. But when Berry Gordy absorbed Rick Tick into Motown, the song was buried in the catalog and largely forgotten. Northern Soul DJs at the Twisted Wheel in Manchester picked it up in the late 1960s and made it a floor filler. It became one of the earliest and most foundational records in the scene. So essential that Northern Soul historian Eddie Crowsdale cited it as one of the songs that defined what the Northern Soul sound was supposed to be. Starr himself became a regular on the Northern Soul circuit in later years, understanding exactly what those British audiences wanted. The same raw, urgent energy he had put into War, just pointed at a dance floor instead of a war machine. Edwin Starr died in 2003. Stop Her On Sight is still a Northern Soul essential. It never really left the floor. Number 7, R. Dean Taylor. There's a Ghost in My House, 1967. R. Dean Taylor was one of the very few white artists ever signed to Motown, a Canadian songwriter who earned his place at Hitsville by co-writing hits for The Temptations, The Four Tops, and Diana Ross. But when it came to his own recording career, Motown had almost no interest. They buried his 1967 single, There's a Ghost in My House, on a subsidiary label called VIP, gave it zero promotion, and watched it disappear. The song had been written with Holland Dozier Holland, the most successful writing partnership in Motown history. The lyrics use ghostly imagery as a metaphor for the lingering pain of lost love, and the production had a garage soul urgency that set it apart from anything else Motown was releasing. Ian Levine, the DJ at the Blackpool Mecca, who would become one of the Northern Soul scene's most important figures, discovered the original pressing on a record-buying trip to America and debuted it at the Mecca. The crowd went wild. Every serious Northern Soul DJ immediately began hunting for a copy. Demand became so intense that copies surfaced in the most unlikely places, including a budget compilation sold at motorway service stations across the North. Motown took notice. In 1974, 7 years after the original release, they reissued it on the Tamla Motown label. It entered the UK singles chart in May and peaked at number 3 in June, remaining on the chart for 12 weeks. Taylor told Melody Maker he was staggered but delighted. A song that received zero promotion in 1967 went top 3 in 1974 because the North refused to let it go. Number 6, Jimmy Radcliffe, Long After Tonight Is All Over, 1965. Jimmy Radcliffe was a New York session musician, arranger, conductor, and songwriter who worked on everything from Broadway orchestrations to television jingles. In my arms, when I hold you. By the time of his death, in July 1973, at just 36 years old, he had worked on over 200 TV and radio commercials, arranged sessions for major artists, and written songs for the Walker Brothers. I can feel that the world is mine. The recording that made him immortal was a Burt Bacharach and Hal David composition he cut in 1964. It reached number 40 on the UK singles chart in 1965. Or I'll cry till the end of time. Let me. A minor hit that earned him a brief promotional tour of Britain. Then it disappeared. 8 years later, Wigan casino DJ Russ Winstanley found the record and began closing his all-nighters with it every Saturday night. At around 7:30 in the morning, as several thousand exhausted dancers began their reluctant descent toward dawn, Winstanley would drop that opening chord, and the room would transform completely. Dancers who had been on their feet since 2 in the morning found a second wind. Long After Tonight Is All Over became the second of the legendary 3 Before 8. The 3 songs played at the close of every Wigan casino all-nighter for 8 consecutive years. Radcliffe never knew. He died in July 1973, just 2 months before Wigan Casino held its very first all-nighter in September of that year. Let me tell you. His song made thousands of people cry at sunrise. His song played at the close of the final Wigan Casino all-nighter in December 1981. He never lived to see a single second of it. Some songs outlived their makers by decades. This one outlived him by generations.
Long after tonight is over.
Number 5, Toby Legend, Time Will Pass You By, 1968. She recorded it thinking it was a demo. A label released it without telling her. Then they released it under a fake name without asking her. And then it became one of the most beloved songs in Northern Soul history. Her real name was Bessie Grace Gupton, born in Alabama, raised in Detroit, a gospel singer from the age of 9. She had backed up B.B. King, the Four Tops, Ben E. King, Wilson Pickett, King Curtis, and Duke Ellington before she was 30. When she cut Time Will Pass You By in Detroit in 1968, she was running through the song with the musicians. A scratch vocal, nothing more. Then she discovered that Mala Records had quietly pressed it and released it as a single, under the name Toby Legend, a name they invented. Without telling her, she was furious. The song went nowhere in America. Then Northern Soul DJs picked it up in the early 1970s and played it at Wigan Casino. It became the opening song of the 3 Before 8, the first song of the closing ritual at every all-nighter for 8 years. Guardian journalist Laura Barton compared its lyrics to a Shakespeare sonnet, noting how the chorus, "Life is just a precious minute, baby. Open up your eyes and see it, baby," landed with devastating power at 7:30 in the morning after 8 hours of dancing. The Northern Soul scene spent years trying to find out who Toby Legend actually was. When they finally tracked her down, she was completely unaware that thousands of British people considered her one of the most important voices they had ever heard. The song she thought was just a warm-up had become, for those people, a kind of church. Number 4, Gloria Jones, Tainted Love, 1964.
Sometimes I feel I've got to.
Before Soft Cell, before the number 1 in the 43 consecutive weeks on the American Billboard Hot 100, Tainted Love was a B-side on a failed single that nobody bought. Gloria Jones recorded it in Los Angeles in 1964. Writer Ed Cobb described how it came together. Once the word tainted had popped into my head, the song was written very quickly, probably 15 minutes. Glenn Campbell played lead guitar on the session. Motown songwriter Frank Wilson's wife, Barbara, had sung a demo version. When it came to pressing Cobb's song, it was placed on the B-side of a single called My Bad Boy's Coming Home, released in 1965. Both sides failed. Not a single chart position in the U.S. or the U.K. Then, in 1973, Northern Soul DJ Richard Serling visited a Philadelphia warehouse full of deleted and returned stock.
Right, you need someone to hold you tight.
He found a copy of the Gloria Jones single. He played it at Vava's Club in Bolton, then at Wigan Casino. The crowd responded with the kind of complete unanimous approval that Northern Soul dancers reserved only for the very best records.
Sorry, I don't play that way.
Jones re-recorded the song in 1976, produced by her boyfriend Mark Bolan of T-Rex. It also failed to chart.
To hold you tight, and who think love is
Soft Cell covered it in 1981 after discovering it through the Northern Soul scene and went to #1 across Europe.
me to make things right. You need someone.
The song spent a then record 43 weeks on the American Hot 100. Gloria Jones has said she considers the Soft Cell version the best. A B-side on a record nobody bought in 1965 became the defining synth pop song of the 1980s.
Get away. You don't really want.
Because one DJ found it in a bin in Philadelphia in 1973.
I've got to run away. I've got to.
Number 3, Dean Parrish, I'm on My Way, 1967.
You're here today, then you're gone.
Phil Anastasi was born to Italian parents in Brooklyn and grew up listening to Frank Sinatra drifting from apartment windows on summer nights. Ronnie Spector, lead singer of the Ronettes, told him to go solo and to change his name. He became Dean Parrish. Between 1964 and 1967, he recorded for 4 American labels, making soul records with a voice so deep and powerful that audiences were always shocked to discover it belonged to a lean young white man from Brooklyn. I'm on My Way was recorded in 1967. It flopped completely. That same year, Parrish quietly retired, reverted to his real name, became an actor, and eventually played guitar on Bob Marley's Reggae on Broadway in 1972. He had completely forgotten Dean Parrish had ever existed. Then Russ Winstanley found his record. Now he played it at the close of every Wigan casino all-nighter, the very last song of the 3 before 8.
I'm on my way.
For years, nobody on the Northern Soul circuit could identify who Dean Parrish actually was. He had vanished. In 2001, Parrish made contact with Winstanley and flew to the UK for the first time in his life. He performed I'm on My Way live, the first time he had performed it since 1967. The audience knew every single word. He stood at the microphone in complete silence afterward, trying to process what had just happened, and later described it as the greatest moment of his entire life. I'm on My Way was the last record ever played at Wigan Casino on the night of December 6, 1981. Dean Parrish died in June 2021. The song still gets played at every Northern Soul night on earth.
To the city.
Number 2, Jackie Wilson, I Get the Sweetest Feeling, 1968.
The better you look.
Michael Jackson studied Jackie Wilson's every move. Elvis Presley said he was the greatest entertainer alive. And I Get the Sweetest Feeling, recorded in Chicago in 1968 on Brunswick Records, is one of the finest soul records ever made. Produced by Carl Davis, it was built around a rolling, irresistible groove at exactly the right tempo for an all-night dance floor. In America, it reached number 34 on the Hot 100 and number 5 on the R&B chart, a solid hit that then quietly disappeared. In the UK, it wasn't even released initially. Northern Soul DJs began importing copies and playing it across the North through the late 1960s and early 1970s.
Mama, the sweetest.
The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every time it dropped, the floor filled completely. When British promoters finally pushed Brunswick to release it in the UK in 1972, it entered the chart and climbed to number 9, giving Wilson his biggest UK hit, 4 years after it was recorded in Chicago.
The greater your love.
It brought him back to British stages. He toured the UK in 1975. Then, in September 1975, he collapsed on stage during a concert at the Latin Casino in New Jersey, suffering a massive heart attack that left him in a coma.
That I could cry.
He remained in that coma until his death in January 1984. But I Get the Sweetest Feeling never stopped playing. It was re-released in the UK in 1987 and reached number 3 on the charts, 19 years after it was first recorded. The Northern Soul scene kept that song alive through 2 decades of industry indifference. Jackie Wilson's greatest British hit was made possible by dancers in the north of England who simply refused to let it disappear. Number 1. Frank Wilson, Do I Love You? Indeed I Do, 1965. Frank Wilson recorded 1 single for Motown, 1, and Berry Gordy ordered every copy destroyed. In October 1965, Wilson, a songwriter producing for Motown's West Coast operation, recorded a song he had written himself. 250 promo copies were pressed, scheduled for release on December 23, 1965. Then Wilson met with Gordy in Detroit. Gordy asked him directly, "Do you truly want a performing career, or do you want to be a writer and producer?" Wilson chose the latter. The release was canceled. The pressings were destroyed. Most of them, a handful, survived. In 1977, a Motown archivist named Tom DiPero found a surviving copy in the label's files. A record dealer named Simon Susan discovered it, recognized its potential, and bootlegged it under the fake name Eddie Foster, speeding it up slightly, and sent an acetate to Wigan Casino. DJ Russ Winstanley played it once. He had to sit down. It became the biggest anthem the casino had ever heard. When the fake name was exposed in 1978 and the true artist revealed, the record became a collector's obsession beyond anything the scene had ever seen. One copy sold for £15,000 in 1996, a world record for a 7-inch single at the time. In 2020, a UK collector named Lee Jeffries paid £100,000 for one of only 2 known original copies. Motown officially released the single in the UK in November 1979. 14 years after it was recorded, Frank Wilson described hearing the song revered decades later as one of my life's greatest achievements. He died in 2012. On the final night of Wigan Casino in December 1981, after the crowd refused to leave, DJ Russ Winstanley reached into his box and pulled out a record at random. It was Do I Love You? Indeed I Do. It became the last song ever played at Wigan Casino, which means that Berry Gordy's most famous act of deletion became the most important record the scene ever produced.